a world searching for meaning, few texts have shaped history, hearts, and human identity like the Bible. But beyond the verses and chapters lies a story, ancient, eternal, and alive. Welcome to Speed Reads, where we journey book by book through Scripture. Not in fragments, but as sweeping narratives rich with depth, drama, and divine design. Whether you're rediscovering these sacred texts or exploring them for the first time, each episode brings you closer to the heartbeat of the Bible, one book at a time. The book of Joshua marks a new chapter in the history of Israel. The wilderness wanderings are over, and the Israelites, led by Joshua, are on the brink of entering the Promised Land. Moses, who led the Israelites out of Egypt, has passed away, and now it is Joshua's responsibility to guide the people into their inheritance. Joshua's story is one of courage, faith, and obedience, and the book of Joshua is one of victory, conquest, and fulfillment of God's promises. The opening chapters of Joshua begin with God commissioning Joshua to take up the mantle of leadership after Moses' death. The Lord encourages Joshua to be strong and courageous, reminding him that God's presence will go with him, just as it did with Moses. God promises Joshua that every place he sets foot will be given to him, as it was promised to Moses. This divine assurance sets the tone for the entire book. The success of Israel in the Promised Land is contingent upon their obedience to God and their faith in His power. Joshua's first major task is to lead the people across the Jordan River. God miraculously parts the waters, just as He did at the Red Sea, allowing the Israelites to cross on dry ground. This event is a powerful reminder of God's continued faithfulness to His people. Once across the river, Joshua orders 12 men, one from each tribe, to take a stone from the riverbed and set up a memorial at Gilgal. This memorial is a reminder for future generations of the great thing that God had done, and it serves as a testament to His power and provision. With the crossing of the Jordan, the Israelites are now in the land that God promised to give to their ancestors. The first city they encounter is Jericho, a fortified city that stands as an obstacle between them and the full possession of the land. The Israelites are commanded by God to march around the city once a day for 6 days, and on the seventh day they are to march around the city 7 times, with the priests blowing trumpets. On the 7th time the people are to shout, and God will cause the walls of Jericho to fall down. The Israelites follow God's instructions to the letter, and the walls of Jericho miraculously collapse. The city is taken, and its inhabitants are destroyed, except for Rahab, a woman who had hidden the Israelite spies and helped them escape. Rahab and her family are spared, and they become part of the Israelite community, symbolizing the grace of God even for those outside of Israel. The fall of Jericho is a stunning victory, but it is followed by a tragic defeat at Ai. The Israelites, feeling confident after their victory at Jericho, attempt to take the smaller city of Ai but are routed by its inhabitants. Joshua is devastated, and he seeks God's guidance, only to discover that Israel's defeat is due to the sin of one of their own, Ai. Ai had taken forbidden spoils from Jericho, disobeying God's command to destroy everything in the city. This sin brings judgment upon Israel, and Ai and his family are punished by being stoned to death. Once the sin is dealt with, the Israelites are able to conquer Ai, and they renew their commitment to God. Joshua builds an altar to the Lord on Mount Ebal, where the Israelites reaffirm the covenant and recite the blessings and curses of the law. This act of worship symbolizes the people's continued dependence on God and their commitment to following His commands as they move forward in the conquest of the land. The next major event in Joshua's leadership is the alliance with the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites, fearing the Israelites, deceive them by pretending to be from a distant land. They ask for a peace treaty, and Joshua, without consulting God, agrees to their request. When the Israelites discover the deception, they are angered but honor their oath, and the Gibeonites are spared. This story serves as a reminder of the importance of seeking God's guidance in all decisions, no matter how trivial they may seem. After this, Joshua leads Israel in a series of military campaigns to conquer the southern and northern regions of Canaan. The Israelites fight and defeat various kings and their armies, and the land is gradually subdued. Throughout these battles, God is with Joshua, granting him victory after victory. The success of the Israelites is attributed to their obedience to God and their trust in His power. These conquests fulfill the promises that God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they lay the foundation for the nation of Israel in the Promised Land. As the land is divided among the 12 tribes of Israel, Joshua ensures that each tribe receives its inheritance according to God's command. The tribes are allotted their territories, and the Levites, who do not receive a territorial inheritance, are given cities in which to live. These cities are designated as cities of refuge, where those who accidentally kill someone can flee for protection until a fair trial is held. This provision reflects God's concern for justice and mercy. In his final speeches, Joshua exhorts the Israelites to remain faithful to God and to keep his commandments. He reminds them of all that God has done for them, delivering them from slavery in Egypt, leading them through the wilderness, and giving them victory over their enemies. Joshua challenges them to choose whom they will serve, the gods of their ancestors or the Lord, who has brought them into the promised land. He famously declares, "But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." Joshua's words are a call to commitment and loyalty to God, and the Israelites respond by renewing their covenant with God. They pledge to serve him alone, and Joshua records these words in the book of the law of God, setting up a large stone as a witness to their commitment. This stone stands as a reminder of the covenant, and it is a symbol of God's faithfulness and the people's responsibility to remain faithful to him. The book of Joshua ends with the death of Joshua at the age of 110. Before he dies, he is buried in the land of his inheritance, and the people continue to live in the land that God gave them. The book closes with a note about the faithfulness of the Lord, who kept his promises to the Israelites, and with a reminder that the people had received the land, just as God had sworn to give it to their ancestors. The book of Judges begins a period of Israel's history marked by instability, moral decline, and repeated cycles of sin, suffering, and salvation. It takes place after the death of Joshua, when the Israelites, now settled in the Promised Land, failed to fully conquer the land and live in the peace that God intended for them. The Israelites face the consequences of their disobedience to God, and the narrative of Judges reflects a downward spiral into corruption and chaos. Yet God's faithfulness and mercy shine through. Judges spans several generations and shows the rise of judges, leaders who are raised up by God to deliver Israel from its enemies and to guide the people in times of crisis. The book begins with the Israelites' failure to fully drive out the inhabitants of Canaan, as commanded by God. Instead of remaining distinct and faithful to God, the Israelites become entangled with the surrounding nations, adopting their idols and customs, leading to the spiritual decay of the nation. The central theme of Judges is the repeated cycle of sin and redemption. This cycle consists of four main stages. The Israelites fall into sin and idolatry. God allows them to be oppressed by their enemies. They cry out to God for deliverance, and God raises up a judge to save them. Once the judge dies, however, the cycle repeats itself, and the people once again turn away from God. In Judges 1, the Israelites begin their conquest of the land of Canaan. Although they achieve some victories, they fail to drive out all of the inhabitants, which sets the stage for future conflict and idolatry. The tribes of Judah and Simeon have successes, but the other tribes, such as Ephraim and Manasseh, struggle with the Canaanite inhabitants. The failure to completely conquer the land leads to the Israelites becoming increasingly influenced by the surrounding cultures. The opening chapter also introduces the angel of the Lord, who rebukes Israel for failing to fully obey God's commands and warns them of the consequences. This sets the tone for the rest of the book, as Israel's disobedience is highlighted time and time again. Judges 2 marks the beginning of the cycle of sin. After Joshua's death, the Israelites turn away from God and begin to worship the gods of the surrounding nations. As a result, God allows them to be oppressed by foreign powers. The Israelites' hearts are hardened, and they are trapped in a pattern of sin, oppression, repentance, and deliverance. In this chapter, we see the introduction of the judges, leaders raised by God to deliver his people from oppression. The first judge introduced is Othniel in Judges 3. He delivers Israel from the hands of the king of Mesopotamia. But once he dies, the Israelites fall into sin again. The next judge, Ehud, is raised up to deliver Israel from the oppression of the Moabites. Ehud's story is one of bravery and cunning. He assassinates the Moabite king and leads the Israelites to victory. But after his death, the cycle of sin continues. In Judges 4, the Israelites are oppressed by the Canaanites, and God raises up Deborah, a prophetess and judge. Deborah is a powerful leader who calls for action and enlists the help of Barak, a military leader. Together they defeat the Canaanite army, and Israel experiences peace for 40 years. Deborah's story is one of courage, wisdom, and faithfulness to God's plan. The next major figure is Gideon, introduced in Judges 6 through 8. Gideon is an unlikely hero, a man from the weakest tribe in Israel, but God calls him to deliver Israel from the Midianites. Despite his initial doubt and fear, Gideon obeys God's call. He leads a small army, reduced from 32,000 men to just 300, and defeats the Midianite army in a miraculous victory. Gideon's story is a powerful example of God using the weak and the humble to accomplish his purposes. However, after Gideon's death, Israel falls into sin once again, and his sons lead the nation into further turmoil. In Judges 9, we see the rise of Abimelech, one of Gideon's sons, who seeks to make himself king. He murders his brothers to secure his position, but his reign is short-lived, as he is eventually overthrown. The story of Abimelech is a tragic example of how the lust for power leads to destruction and chaos. Next comes Jephthah in Judges 10-12, who is called to lead Israel against the Ammonites. Jephthah is an outsider, the son of a prostitute, but God uses him to deliver Israel. Jephthah makes a tragic vow that leads to the sacrifice of his daughter, highlighting the dangers of making rash promises to God. His story is one of bravery, but also of the consequences of ill-considered decisions. Samson, perhaps the most well-known of the judges, appears in Judges 13-16. Samson is born to a barren woman through divine intervention, and from birth, he is dedicated to God as a Nazirite. His strength is legendary, but his downfall is rooted in his inability to resist the temptations of sin, particularly his relationship with the Philistine woman Delilah, who betrays him. Samson's final act of strength is his destruction of the Philistine temple, killing himself and thousands of Philistines in the process. Samson's story is tragic, showing the danger of pride and the destructive power of sin. However, his death is also a moment of redemption, as God uses his final act to deliver Israel from the Philistines. The final chapters of Judges 17-21 depict a time of utter moral decline in Israel. The story of Micah and the Levite in Judges 17-20 shows how far Israel has fallen from God's commands. Micah sets up his own shrine and a Levite becomes his personal priest, a violation of God's law. Later, the tribe of Dan steals the shrine and establishes it as their own idol. This chapter reflects the chaos and confusion of the time, as everyone does what seems right in their own eyes. The final narrative in Judges 19-21 is one of the darkest in the Bible, involving the brutal rape and murder of a Levite's concubine and the subsequent civil war between the tribes of Israel. The story reveals the depth of Israel's moral corruption and the devastating consequences of abandoning God's law. The book ends with a chilling statement, "In those days Israel had no king, everyone did as they saw fit." Judges 21-25, emphasizing the need for godly leadership and the consequences of rejecting God's authority. One book at a time. The book of Ruth stands as a beautiful testament to loyalty, love, and redemption. It is one of the shortest books in the Bible, but one of the richest in meaning. Set during the time of the Judges, when Israel was in a state of spiritual and moral decline, Ruth presents a story of steadfast faith in the midst of hardship, and it beautifully showcases God's providence working through human choices. The story begins with a family living in Bethlehem, the town that will later be famous as the birthplace of Jesus Christ. This family is headed by Elimelech, whose name means God is my king. He and his wife Naomi have 2 sons. Due to a severe famine in the land of Israel, the family decides to leave Bethlehem and move to Moab, a neighboring country, in search of food. Moab, however, is a land historically hostile to Israel, as the Moabites were descendants of Lot, and the relationship between the 2 nations was often tense. While in Moab, Elimelech dies, leaving Naomi a widow. Her 2 sons marry Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. After about 10 years, both sons die, leaving Naomi with no husband and no children. In this period of tragedy and loss, Naomi hears that the famine in Israel has ended, and she decides to return to Bethlehem. She encourages her daughters-in-law to stay in Moab and return to their families, as she believes she cannot offer them any hope or future. Orpah reluctantly agrees and returns to her family, but Ruth, despite being urged by Naomi to leave, clings to Naomi in an act of remarkable loyalty. Ruth's declaration to Naomi is one of the most beautiful and faithful statements in the Bible. "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God." Ruth's words demonstrate her deep commitment to Naomi, but even more so, they show her commitment to the God of Israel. This declaration of faith is pivotal, as it sets the course for the rest of the story. When they arrive in Bethlehem, Naomi is greeted by the people, but she is deeply sorrowful, feeling as though God has dealt bitterly with her. She changes her name to Mara, meaning bitter, to reflect the pain and loss she has experienced. Ruth, however, begins to take action to provide for Naomi. In accordance with Jewish law, Ruth goes to glean in the fields during the barley harvest. Gleaning was a practice where the poor and widows could collect leftover grain from the fields after the main harvesters had taken what they needed. By God's providence, Ruth ends up gleaning in the field of Boaz, a wealthy and respected man from Bethlehem, who happens to be a relative of Naomi's deceased husband. Boaz notices Ruth's work ethic and kindness toward Naomi, and he goes out of his way to ensure that she is protected and treated well. He gives instructions to his workers to allow her to gather grain freely, even leaving extra for her to collect. This kindness from Boaz does not go unnoticed by Ruth, and she expresses her gratitude to him for his generosity. Naomi, upon hearing of Boaz's kindness, realizes that he is a kinsman redeemer, a close relative who has the legal right to redeem the family's property and marry a widow to ensure the continuation of the family line. Naomi encourages Ruth to take bold action and approach Boaz in a culturally appropriate way. She instructs Ruth to go to Boaz's threshing floor at night after the harvest celebration and lie at his feet. This act, though unconventional, is understood as a humble request for Boaz to take on the role of redeemer. Ruth follows Naomi's advice, and Boaz is moved by her action. In the middle of the night, he wakes up to find Ruth lying at his feet. Ruth asks him to spread his cloak over her, symbolizing that she is asking for his protection and for him to fulfill the role of a kinsman redeemer. Boaz is deeply honored by Ruth's request and assures her that he will do what is required. However, there is a closer relative who has the first right of redemption, so Boaz promises to settle the matter the next day. The following day, Boaz goes to the city gate, where legal matters were settled. He meets with the closer relative and offers him the opportunity to redeem the land and marry Ruth. The relative, upon learning that he must also marry Ruth and raise up an heir for her deceased husband, declines, fearing it would affect his own inheritance. Boaz therefore steps in and formally redeems the property, marrying Ruth, and ensuring that her deceased husband's name and line are carried on. Ruth and Boaz's union is blessed by God, and they have a son named Obed, who becomes the grandfather of King David, placing Ruth in the ancestral line of Jesus Christ. The book of Ruth ends with a genealogical record, highlighting how God used this story of love, loss, and redemption to bring about his plan of salvation for Israel and, ultimately, for the world. The story of Ruth is not just a beautiful narrative of love and redemption, but also a profound example of God's providence. Even in the midst of personal tragedy, God is at work, weaving together the lives of his people to fulfill his divine purposes. Ruth, a Moabite woman, is included in the lineage of Israel's greatest king, and through her, God's redemptive plan continues to unfold. Ruth's loyalty to Naomi, her commitment to God, and her obedience to the instructions of her mother-in-law stand as shining examples of faithfulness, even when circumstances seem bleak. The book of Ruth shows how God honors such faithfulness and how his grace can extend to the most unexpected people. The book of Ruth also reveals God's heart for the marginalized and the outsiders. Ruth, a foreigner, is accepted and embraced by the people of Israel. She becomes part of the family of God, not because of her heritage, but because of her faith in the God of Israel. This inclusion foreshadows the inclusion of the Gentiles into the family of God through the work of Jesus Christ. Thank you for joining this deep dive into the living story of Scripture. As we move through each book, remember these ancient words are not just history, they're mirrors, windows, and signposts, pointing us to something greater. If this journey stirred something in you, subscribe to Speed Reads and walk with us through every chapter of God's unfolding masterpiece. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and keep reading the words slowly or quickly.